after a while the neurons change, and the number of keyholes for the drug, the number of neuron receptors actually decrease because
Mm.
you don't need as much, because the brain learns it's being bombarded with this substance all the time in the neuron receptors. So it's like, well, I don't need as many neuron receptors as I did before because I have plenty of this chemical coming in, plenty of this drug. So I'm gonna reduce the 5 neuron receptors down to just 2, right? And so
Mm.
then the person needs more of the substance to bind to those neuron receptors to have that effect that they had when they had 5 neuron receptors.
Welcome back to the Out of the Box podcast, where Steele and I, Jose, your host, get to talk about out of the box ideas. Today, we're going to be talking about how addictions affect social interactions. But before we actually get started, I want to invite you guys to subscribe to our channel. This is a channel committed to providing out of the box ideas. We bring in guests from different fields of studies and also average Joes that have amateur ideas and want to just lovingly and share their passion to others. And so this is a channel that, if it's for you, we hopefully recommend that you subscribe to our channel. But without further ado, Steele, so how addictions affect social interactions, and the first thing that comes to mind with this topic is, an addiction in itself can be consuming, right, in nature, right? Because an addiction sometimes doesn't allow people to function when responsibilities come up, when people are depending on them. That could be, sexual addictions or drug addictions, or maybe there's even more like emotional addictions, like people are so emotionally addicted to being angry or being sad, right, which causes depression. And it's almost like an addiction because they want to feel sad or they want to feel bad because it almost helps them identify with themselves. It's like their comfort zone has become that addiction, right? And so maybe from your psychological stance, maybe if you can explain a little bit more like what psychology says about addictions, like what the definition is, and then we can start applying it to see how it affects social interactions.
Yeah, so addictions in psychology they're now called substance use disorder in the DSM-5. So they're a mental disorder that can be diagnosed if certain criteria are met. There's substance use disorder, which is what we normally think of as an addiction. Then there's like intoxication that can be diagnosed, like substance intoxication for all the different substances, and there's certain symptoms that you look for that as well. Now, substance use disorder requires certain criteria. The most important ones that stand out are increasing tolerance to the drug or substance. So, like, they need more of the substance in order to keep having the same high, the same effect. And then,
Mm.
like, the cravings for it, like, they want to use the substance again when they stop. And then withdrawal symptoms, whenever they stop using, they start experiencing certain physical and psychological, like, negative effects. So like those are the 3 most important things with addictions that stand out. And then so those are substance use addictions, right? To like drugs, alcohol, all that different stuff. But then there's also something called behavioral addictions, which is also called
Mm.
process addictions. And those addictions are still being researched. There's only a few of them that have made it into the DSM-5 for diagnosing mental disorders, like gambling use disorder or gambling disorder or gambling. Yeah, I think it's gambling disorder, to where someone feels the need to keep gambling, or else they have, certain withdrawal or cravings and certain things like that to keep gambling. And then I think they were working on trying to get other addictions in the DSM. So like internet use addiction,
Wow.
porno-
Yeah.
pornography addiction, sex addiction. Uh, what was the other one?
Mm.
Gaming addiction, like video game addiction. Uh, what are the others? So yeah, different behavioral addictions. Um, they still haven't really made it to be like where they can be diagnosed. And the most controversial one is actually a sex addiction because
Mm.
it's hard to like there's such a huge gray area because most human beings crave and want sex at some point in their life.
It's like inherent,
It's
right?
like a
Like,
natural desire, right? So it's like, how do you turn that into a mental disorder? Where do you draw the line? Like, so
yeah,
that one's, people are still debating heavily on that. So yeah, I mean that's just like an overview, right? So like the main symptoms:
yeah,
withdrawal, tolerance, cravings. So
yeah, and that's interesting. That you mentioned that, because I think most people know that, or most people who have an addiction to some degree know that it's bad, but they still continue to do it because it's already ingrained in their habitual behaviors, right? And so it's become ingrained to the point where they self-identify with that type of behavior, almost to say, as somebody identifies with being a school teacher, or their profession, right? They self-identify with that certain addiction, and so it causes them to have those withdrawals, right? Because they're like, hey, this is what I used to be. The body chemically, I guess, accepted it as well, right? Because there's, like you said, chemical interactions that happen in the brain that solidify and create, neural pathways that
yeah,
confirm your identity as like a sex addict, or a drug addict, or and that in itself becomes a withdrawal, because it's challenging that belief that one had previously, right? And so I think it's interesting how, I'm surprised, like some people can just like cold turkey just stop
yeah,
doing what used to be an addiction, unless it wasn't an addiction, right? But like there's some people that, I've read a book that talked about, like, this man who went into the streets and like helped people who were in drug addictions, and he said that some people would just like cold turkey stop. And he said that for the first 3, or maybe even the first week, that they would have like um physical withdrawals, right? It was specifically like drug withdrawals. But after the week, after they were able to pass through that week, that they just like, it was like nothing, that they could stop. But I think there was other factors that might have been involved in that. But it's
it's complicated.
yeah, it is complicated. I think it is. And it's so interesting how that can happen. Um, but yeah, I mean, now now that we understand like addictions, like how how do you think that it affects social interactions?
Yeah, I think several ways. So there's different stages. So if we were to look at when the addiction has already started and the addiction's been going on for quite some time, then that's actually one of the criteria for substance use disorder. So one of the other main criteria is the use of the substance creating social problems, problems in life, like problems at work, like being late to work, uh,
Mm-hmm.
use during the day, use in the like alcohol use, for example. Using alcohol in the morning, usually that's a sign that an addiction could be starting. Not in every single case, but in a fair amount. And of course, there's other factors that play into it. And then there's also like risky use. Is that person taking substantial legal risks to get the substance, and is it interfering with their life as a result? Are they putting their lives in danger, other people's lives in danger because of the substance? That's when they're putting the substance above not only their life, but other people's lives. And that's when it's so severe that they can only think of using the substance. And that's when you more likely to classify it as a substance use disorder, an addiction, because it's so severe that it's interfering with life significantly. And like I said, interfering with social relationships in different ways. Like maybe they're hiding their use of the drug and that's affecting relationships with their wife or children.
Yeah,
That creates conflict. It just does. And or they're not spending as much time with their family because they're spending more time using the substance or chasing the substance. Or another common thing is they're trying to find money to sustain the getting the substance, to keep using the substance. So they're trying to borrow money from family or friends all the time, and that's becoming a financial bar. They're doing financial things behind their back. And then of course, then the next phase could be after they're trying to stop using the substance. So they've gone through a rehabilitation program or quick cold turkey. They're like they haven't relapsed in 30 days or something like that. And then the social relationships could be affected with, withdrawal, like they're struggling, and or are there cravings. Sometimes they might beg the family member for the drug, please let me have this kind of thing. And so it can affect relationships like that too. And then also, like we talked about in a prior podcast, the last thing is cues, cues for use of the substance. So if they go hanging with the same people, friends they were hanging with when they were
Mm,
using the drug, then they're more likely to relapse because
it
those
reactivates.
their cues for their reminders of using the substance,
Mm.
be more likely to relapse. So that's the other thing. So,
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that because I was just about to ask you right now. Like, I know that there's people that maybe for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, they they're clean. They are not doing drugs or are not addicted to what they used to be, the substance that they used to be addicted to. But then they relapse. Is that because they might have hit a certain cue along the way that just like put them back into that scenario? Um, because one of the things that I've realized, talking, with my girlfriend, talking with other people, is that there's certain things that kind of get so ingrained in your memory that it's almost like slightly there, and it's just you know waiting for you to hit the touch that string for it to come back and like
yeah.
get the memory going on again. And I was reading a book about just stopping sexual addictions and stuff like that. And it was saying that people who have been able to conquer their sexual addictions or whatever addiction it is, they they did scans on people's brains, and it literally created new neural pathways
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
of like of so that it's almost like, if we think about it as cities, it created a new road, right? It created a new road that was more efficient. So yeah, that way you don't have to use this longer road because this longer road wastes time for family and for important things. And it is just like a narrow road that whenever you need to use it, you use it. But I think sometimes like maybe people's GPS get lost and they turn into that road, right? That used to be paved there. And even though it's crazy and like it's not as efficient as the other one, sometimes it can be there, right? But but I think as we strengthen and widen the new narrow pathways, I think that there's less likelihood of going there because one, it's not logical, right? Anymore, because now we have this bigger road, right? If we're thinking about it in the analogy, we have this bigger road, we have this big highway that we can use to get faster to and do things. And not only is it faster, but like it's just it's healthier because I'm not wasting energy over here like trying to go off of this road. And so I think about it like that when it said like it creates new neural pathways. So
Yeah,
that's so interesting.
yeah, you're right. With the road, going off the road analogy, when a neural pathway, a new road is formed in the brain with the after using that substance over and over for long periods of several weeks and months and then years, that road gets stronger and stronger each time the person uses a substance. And so when they try
Mhm.
to stop using it, and then let's say years pass and they haven't used a substance in years, that road is still there. And because the road is there when it wasn't there before the use of substance, it's far easier to fall back on that road than it was before the road was built. Because once that road is built there, once that neural pathway is there, it's far easier to fall back into that. That's why habits, which are built in similar ways to addictions, are so hard to break and hard to change because it is a lot more physical in our brain than we realize. Kind of like you said, with the fMRI scans of the brain, as it probably showed that, like you were mentioning earlier. So definitely true. I mean, and that's it's quite fascinating. I mean, and the chemical, like the part of the brain, like with like just to give an example of how physical it is in our brain, you know, when we use a drug, tolerance builds up. What is tolerance really? What is it actually? So we use the substance, it binds to certain neuron receptors in our brain, which we can think of as keyholes. Like you have a keyhole in each, you have unique keys that only work in certain holes. And the same thing with certain medications and drugs and substances, only certain chemicals bind to certain neuron receptors in our brain. And when they get transferred through that synaptic gap between our neurons, you know, after a long period of time of doing that drug over and over and over again and binding to the receptors over and over and over again in the synaptic gap, it's like after a while the neurons change, and the number of keyholes for the drug, the number of neuron receptors actually decrease because
Mm,
you don't need as much because the brain learns it's being bombarded with this substance all the time in the neuron receptors. So it's like, well, I don't need as many neuron receptors as I did before because I have plenty of this chemical coming in, plenty of this drug. So I'm gonna reduce the 5 neuron receptors down to just 2, right? And so
mm,
then the person needs more of the substance to bind to those neuron receptors to have that effect that they had when they had 5 neuron receptors. And so there is a really physical change in those neurons when you use a drug for a long time. And that's why tolerance builds up because you need more because there's only 2 now. And then when you stop using the drug, of course, now it's like, oh, I need more of the substance. It's the brain's freaking out. And then after a while, the neuron receptors will start coming back, and then you'll have 5 receptors again because it's like I need more fishing poles to catch the fish, I guess, as an analogy,
yeah.
because I'm not getting as much of the substance. So that's an example of how tolerance is a physical change in the brain. It really is.
Wow.
Uh,
And is there certain things that people recommend? Um, like I know there's extreme cases, but like for people who just have like minor like addictions to video games or to like
yeah.
just other substances, like is there something that helps them, like you said, reduce the threshold um in a progressive way, or is there on I mean, I'm sure there's more than one option, but like stopping cold turkey and then maybe like progressively. Um, but is there ways that people recommend to deal with addictions?
Um, well, we could take maybe like behavioral addictions, like video game addiction, maybe. There's so many different treatments for it, uh, and it really does depend on the person. It depends. It's kind of a case by case basis, but you could take an example of in general what we would probably try to do with video game addiction, for example, is to slowly decrease the use of the video game. And that's often the case for certain drugs too. Like you don't just quitting certain drugs like alcohol specifically, cold turkey it's quite dangerous depending on how addicted the person is. You can actually have near death experiences, not in the term of near death experience, but you can come close to death if you just quit alcohol cold turkey and your body's severely dependent on it because it can lead to seizures and other medical problems. And so what treatment often sometimes does is to gradually decrease the use of the substance. I've heard one of my mentors was talking about how someone was addicted to codeine, an anti-anxiety medication, I think. And
Coding, like computer coding?
no, codeine, yeah, codeine, like
Oh, okay, coding. Okay.
DINE.
Mm,
Oh, it's an opioid. Okay, it's an opioid pain reliever. So opioids are highly addictive, as we know. And so what they had to do they had to taper them off. We call it tapering off. And so they would cut the pill, slowly reduce the size of the pill, and drag that out as long as possible. So instead of just quitting codeine cold turkey, they cut the pill, physically cut it in smaller sizes, weeks and weeks and weeks apart until the person was able to take only half a codeine and then only a quarter of a codeine and then only like less than that. And so sometimes you have to taper off. So like video game addiction, maybe the same thing. Maybe you just have to
have to
reduce
climb.
like 8 hours. Now I need you to go to 7 hours for a week and see how we do. Now let's go down to 6 hours for a week, five, and then down to 2 hours a day a week until you can get it down to 1 hour a day a week, and then
Yeah.
maybe you can get it down to like only 3 times a week, 1 hour at a time, and so you gradually decrease whatever it is they're addicted to instead of just
Yeah. And aside from having those, because those addictions probably are caused because of something. Maybe there's a root cause of why those addictions arise in the first place, right? Somebody doesn't just wake up and start playing 8 hours a day video games,
Mhm.
right? It's something maybe that they're trying to escape something that's going on in their life, or
Using it as a
something,
coping
or
mechanism.
or it's a coping mechanism for stress, or you know. And so, is there long lasting effects of an addiction? And if so, what can people do to kind of ground themselves back into reality, and like what they need to do, and responsibilities and stuff like that?
Yeah, so there's definitely long-lasting effects of addictions, of long-term substance abuse, and it does depend on the substance. Like for example, certain hallucinogens, like I guess LSD, for example, they don't have near the amount of negative effects depending on how much is used, how often, as something like uh, alcohol, for example. Alcohol can have severe effects. It can affect the liver, lead to cirrhosis. It can damage multiple organs. It can increase the chances of different types of cancer. And it can lead to something called confabulation, where the person doesn't have the right word to use. They can't think of it because of memory issues and brain issues. So they may replace it with a word that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And it can lead to, of course, brain deterioration. Once the liver gets damaged, then that can lead to brain deterioration and brain damage. And so, yeah, in comparison to LSD, I mean, yeah, alcohol can have far more severe effects long term that might not be reversible in many cases. In many cases, a lot of those things you can't just undo. You can get a liver transplant, but you can't undo the cirrhosis and or the brain damage. A lot of times you can't undo that.
Mm,
When I say it depends on how much, because like even we could say that about LSD, but then again, if you use a ton of LSD, like a lot for a long period of time, then that could cause brain damage potentially, possibly. I've seen it with my own eyes with my biological dad. Like he used a lot of drugs, and I saw, and of course it was tied with psychosis and stuff too. But his brain was permanently changed, and there's no way to undo that. It's
yeah.
and so yeah. I mean, when the reason why I bring up LSD is because that's one of the drugs that is strange because unlike other drugs, there isn't really much of a tolerance to LSD. There's a little bit, but not much. And then no one really knows about any kind of addiction to LSD that we're aware of. There's not really withdrawal, there's not really cravings for it. It's one of those rare drugs that just doesn't meet all the criteria the same way. So,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, it depends on the person too. And how much of the substance is used, how long the substance is used in terms of the long-term effects. And then some
Yeah.
of those effects might be reversible, might not. Brain damage, usually not. Uh, and another thing I wanted to say that's important, um, drugs do change the brain permanently sometimes when they're used for a long time in terms of pleasure, in terms of enjoyment. So when someone uses the drug, they'll get to a point where they only get pleasure from using the drug and nothing else, not even sex, not even entertainment, not even the activities they used to enjoy. And sometimes even after they stop using the drug for a long time, that effect stays and they still struggle with something called anhedonia, the inability to enjoy pleasurable activities. And yeah, that includes sex and all this, any other pleasurable activities, hobbies. So that's an example. The brain can permanently change, and then they no longer enjoy life as much. And it's yeah, it's unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think about also the psychological effects that it has, right? Not just the chemical effects and the changes of the brain in itself chemically, but also the, I guess, like how it affects psychologically, because I think that there's certain things that sway one's brain to, or oneself to believe certain things about the world,
So you
or
wonder,
maybe that's why there's a lot of anxieties, right? Because nowadays, like, I mean, pat with my parents, anxiety didn't exist. I mean, maybe it wasn't diagnosed, but it just didn't exist. And I don't know if it's because of the constant pace of the society where we're living on a constant, you know, fast pace that you need to do this, that, this, that, this. Our bodies are so consumed by like external substances that are constantly in our face, you know, like an addiction to work or an addiction, like you said, to the internet. And it's like
Yep.
you need that high of like seeing people follow you or likes and stuff, and that's what one craves, right? To be liked on social media, um stuff like that it's almost like a craving, and causes to some degree some sense of anxiety or overwhelmingness, right? Which causes, you know, which can lead to other things, like when one feels overwhelmed, they need to cope somehow, and so maybe a drinking problem, sex problem, you know, something arises to make them calm down and slow down. And you know, maybe some people need to take drugs, you know, to like feel a little bit more de-stressed from all the work.
Common to
And
use it, and that's what we say. It's more risky when you start using a substance like you may drink alcohol for fun, but it becomes riskier whenever you're using alcohol and only drinking it whenever you have anxiety or depression. Whenever you start using the substance to cope with things like that,
creates an association.
yeah, it's more higher chances of an addiction happening. You know, but you're wondering, are you kind of wondering like if there's psychological things too, like personality wise, or
Yeah, yeah, that's what I'm thinking,
yeah,
like other aspects that can arise, like sense of depression, anxiety,
yeah,
maybe even like socially, like how we had mentioned before, like socially, like that it's just harder for them
definitely,
to open up to people, right? It's harder to open up to people because they've
yeah.
they just have
There
something
are
going
some.
on.
Yeah, there are some. So, like personality traits like impulsiveness, of course, you're going to have a higher chance of addiction because impulsive behaviors involve risky behaviors like drug use and not thinking before acting. And so they're more likely to use the substance more often because they're not thinking about the consequences as often as other people.
Hmm.
Self control, higher self control, less chances of addiction because they have more control over the behavior. Uh, Things like anxiety and depression could increase the chances of substance use to cope with anxiety and depression. Things like a higher need for stimulation. So like people who need more stimulation in order to be stimulated are more likely to use drugs because the everyday life things bore them and they find boring and not stimulating enough that me and you might find stimulating, right? Like watching a movie, but they find it boring, so they need something more powerful than a movie to stimulate them, like drugs. I think there's some other ones like I mean those are the ones that stand out right away.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that you mentioned impulsiveness, right? Because I think there's certain things that, you know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I got from what you had mentioned is that impulsive behavior, for example, when one is 18 or in their youth, can lead to more impulsive behaviors, but in different things later on in life. For example, if one impulsively just play video games, or somebody impulsively watch pornography, or impulsively, like, I don't know, had sex or use drugs, then that impulsive behavior can, even though it's not directly towards that anymore, it can be directed to something else, um, like binge watching, or food behaviors, or just can transition into something else, and not know that it was directly correlated to something from the past. Is that what I'm getting, or is that completely different? That the impulsive behavior can essentially become, um later on in life, the same, but towards something else, directed towards something else.
Yeah, I mean, impulsive behavior can definitely project itself, and like it can start early on, right, in teenager, adolescence, and then it can continue on into adulthood, and like you said, it can shift towards different behaviors, whether that's substance use or video games, or so yeah, that impulsive personality trait can transfer itself to different things in life, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's some genetics that play roles in addictive behaviors if it runs in the family, and that's
Mm,
still, it's not always 100%. Is what I know about that. Like, it's not always 100% guarantee. Like, if someone's an alcoholic, that their son's gonna be an alcoholic. It's not like 100%, but there's some probability there. You know?
yeah. Genetically, it can be passed down, right?
Yeah, all
Because
genetics.
it's understandable, that we have similar cravings as as our parents, right? Like similar cravings, food wise or behavioral wise. That it's just like inherent, right? There's things that I've done that my parents were like, "We never taught you that, but
Mhm.
that's something I like," right? And so it's kind of weird how um how that happens, right? And so it's understandable, like that that can be passed down from one generation to the next. So like you said, it might not even be like that it's developed, it's maybe passed down,
Yeah,
right?
and another personality thing that can play into it that just came back to me is self-esteem. So, like, if someone has low self-esteem, I mean, what do you think's going to happen? They're probably going to be more likely to fall into peer pressure to use
Mm,
drugs. Someone compared to someone with high self-esteem, they're more confident in themselves, have more self-worth. They're more likely to say no when someone offers them drugs because they have more self-worth. They have more self-acceptance. They don't feel like they need acceptance from someone else. Someone with low
mm,
self-esteem, they feel like they need acceptance and belonging from other people because they don't have enough self-worth to be okay on their own. So they need to validate themselves through other people. And so they're
well,
more likely, like I said, to succumb to peer pressure or not say no and just give in to using drugs that someone offers.
that's
So
so interesting that you mentioned that because as somebody that's potentially going to be a future father, um we're both going to potentially be one day with future fathers. I think about this and how I can prepare my kids to be better equipped for reality. And I think the best, one of the many ways is to build that um self-confidence, right? To build that self-confidence, that self-love towards oneself, like not in an egoistic way, but like accepting one's body for what it is, accepting oneself for who they are, accepting um you know the way that they speak, the way that they talk, the way that they think, just like different aspects, and just being grounding them in their self, right? The self confidence. So being confident about themselves, and so that comes with self acceptance. And so I just think about that and how to better equip people for future um moments like that. And I think it's also one of the solutions for people who are already in uh in an addiction, to just help them understand their self-worth and their self um importance, so that they can realize like, oh, I can actually say no because my life is important. I have something to do in this world that is more than just you know be addicted to this substance. And so I think about that, and just like how it can help parents, right, as they're raising their kids. Because nowadays, I mean, we see it, they have their kids on screens, right? And who's teaching them, the screens sometimes, like, what is it telling you? No, you have to buy this product. No, you have to do this because you're not enough. No, your teeth are not wide enough. No, you're not tall enough. No, you're not slim enough. You're not big enough. Or just all these marketing things that are being bombarded. And so technology is teaching kids their self-worth, right? And they see themselves in the mirror and say like, hey, I don't look like this picture in the internet, which is could be Photoshop, could be, altered, who knows. And so they have a wrong perception of what it means to be good enough, right?
Yeah.
And it's so interesting, how it correlates to even addictions, right? The fact that it's one doesn't have good confidence can lead to more probability of starting and then later on developing an addiction.
Yeah. There's a lot that goes into it, and it's complicated. Yeah.
Mm, yeah. Do you have any last thoughts or any last ideas?
Uh, just that. I don't know. I mean, you did ask earlier how does someone get away from addiction, kind of later on, or how do they break free, or kind of something like if they've already started to break free or prevent relapse and stuff. And sometimes it's about creating a list. Like I guess something that comes to mind for me is creating a list of consequences that could happen and really thinking about it. And
Mm,
because with impulsive behavior, you're not going to think before you act, so you need something to go to. So what if you had a physical thing you could look at and go to instead of trying to do it in your mind, which is not likely to happen with impulsiveness, but something you could actually pull out of a drawer and look at and be like, oh yeah, this is why if I do this, this is going to be bad. All there's these risks, there's these consequences, and there's these negative effects. Maybe I should think more about this, instead of going at it. So like that's what I would say, like that's one thing, right? That there's several things that can be done. But just thinking about, having a cheat sheet of the consequences, it gives you more time to think.
yeah. And maybe even also having accountability partners, right? And people that you trust, that you can just verbally talk to them about, these
Yeah.
addictions. Because there's also that aspect of verbalizing what's internally in oneself. And if one bottles it up and doesn't talk about it, it can lead to maybe believing that you can handle it all on your own. And there's nothing wrong with going to ask somebody to hold you accountable to something. And I think that in itself is also a process of giving less power to the addiction. Because I think that's one of the really great things that I see, like in the Catholic Church, and I talk about it objectively because they have what's called confession, and where people can go to a priest and confess their sins. And I think about it, what it does psychologically. And Jordan Peterson talks about this in one of his videos online, that when you speak about your your shortcomings and you verbalize them, now they're not in here, they're outside of yourself. And so you kind of give them less power, because now you can stand away from them and see it from the outside perspective, instead of being inside and not know where to go. And so I think that there's a really interesting aspect of just having an accountability partner and verbalizing it, because it gives it less power and less strength to hold you back. It's almost like a chain. It's like the more that you hold it back, the more that it strengthens. And so it keeps you it keeps you chained in the loop. So
Yeah, someone to hold you accountable and remind you too. Like that's common with 12-step groups like AA, Alcoholics
mm,
Anonymous. Like they'll have
yeah.
a sponsor partner to work with who had gone through the addiction before and can walk them through it and be that support system when they need to call them and stuff like that, to help hold them accountable and stuff like that and remind them. Definitely.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. Well, I think we've had a great conversation about addictions. And guys, let us know what you thought about this video. If you really enjoyed it, we really appreciate your time. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And until next time, we will see you soon. Take care.